You cannot understand what AI is going to do to work without looking at previous changes of this magnitude in the history of work. There have been basically 4 massive changes in the history of work, right? So for most of human history, as I said, people lived where they worked and they worked where they live. And 90% of people spent 90% of their time just with subsistence.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome back to AI and the Future of Work. Thanks again for making this one of the most downloaded podcasts about the future of work. If you enjoy what we do, please like, comment, and share, and we'll keep sharing great conversations like the one we have for today. I'm your host, Dan Turchin, CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. I'm also an investor in and advisor to more than 30 AI-first companies and a firm believer in the power of technology to make humans better. If you're passionate about changing the world with AI, or maybe just looking for your next adventure, let's talk. We learn from AI thought leaders weekly on this show, and of course, the added bonus is you get one AI fun fact each week. Today's fun fact comes from Dr. Lance Elliott, who writes in Forbes that ChatGPT's ability to write and explain jokes is a sign that it's approaching human sensibility. Now, being funny is hard for humans. It's even harder for machines. Dr. Elliott references the Mark Twain quote, "Explaining humor is a lot like dissecting a frog. You learn a lot in the process, but in the end, you kill it." Dr. Elliott's 6,800-word treatise on AI and comedy explores why we need comedy as a society and how, before AI replaces comedians, it will first serve as a co-pilot, helping author and test new material. My personal conclusion, comedic delivery, the human experience of watching masters at their craft on stage, and the interplay of the audience with the comedian are all parts of the innately human experience that AI won't replace, even in a meta world. I, for one, applaud amateur comics everywhere. Delivering a stand-up routine is one of the toughest and most human pursuits. As always, we'll link to the full article in today's show notes. Now, shifting to this week's conversation, we've met some amazing guests over the years, including luminaries like Bill Davidow, who helped found the venture capital industry, and Professor Meredith Broussard, who popularized the important concept of algorithmic accountability. Well, I feel like we're raising the bar today. Bruce Feiler is one of America's most thoughtful voices on contemporary life. He's the author of 7 New York Times bestsellers, including Life is in the Transitions, The Secrets of Happy Families, and Council of Dads. Bruce's 3 TED Talks have been viewed more than 4 million times, and he teaches the TED course, How to Master Life Transitions. His latest book, The Search, Finding Meaningful Work in a Post-Career World, which was just published in May, is a bold new roadmap for finding meaning and purpose at work based on insights drawn from hundreds of life stories. A longtime columnist at the New York Times, Bruce now writes the popular newsletter, The Nonlinear Life. He's appeared in numerous publications, including The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, Harvard Business Review, and Gourmet, where he won 3 James Beard Awards. He's a frequent commentator on radio and television, a former circus clown.
There we go.
He's been the subject of a Jay Leno joke and a Jeopardy question. And AI in the Future of Work aficionados, I got to tell you, this is the first of more than 200 episodes to feature the second half of a husband-wife pair. Bit of trivia, Bruce is married to amazing 2021 guest, Linda Rotenberg, CEO and founder of Endeavor Global. That one also is a must listen. And without further ado, Bruce, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the podcast. Let's get started by having you share a bit more about your illustrious background and how you got into this space.
Yeah, I'm trying to decide whether I should begin with a Jay Leno joke or like a joke about being the trailing spouse, right? Or, a commentary about food or what. So you asked me to talk about my background. I'm sort of inclined to talk about my present, right? Because I am in this kind of massive life transition myself, because my wife, Linda, whom you alluded to just seconds ago, and I just 7 days ago became empty nesters investors. And so our life here in Brooklyn has been turned upside down. And in the last 3 months, this summer alone, I published a new book, marked 15 years since a cancer diagnosis, 20 years of marriage, watched my kids graduate from high school and became an empty nester. And I have been looking around, wondering if anybody knows anything about how to navigate a life transition. And as it happens, this has been my work for the last half a decade plus. So how did I end up in the middle of this conversation? I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, 5 generations of Jews in the American South. And I left there and went to the Northeast to go to college. And in the mid 80s, moved to Japan and started writing letters home of the "you're not going to believe what happened to me" variety. On crinkly airmail paper. That's how old I am, Dan. The kids today, those interested in AI don't know about that onion skin paper that was so thin. There were no lines, and the pad of paper would have lines on it. So you would stick the top of the pad under the paper so that the lines wouldn't get all squiggly. And when I got back to Georgia 6 months later, everyone said, "I loved your letters." And I was like, "Great. Have we met?" And it turned out that my grandmother had Xeroxed those letters, then passed them around, and they went viral in a sort of old-fashioned sense of the word. And I thought, well, if this is that interesting to me and all these people, I should write a book about it. And it doesn't happen this way, but I sold my first book at 24, and I've never held a job since. So in the intervening decades, I spent a year in the circus, as you learned. I wrote books about Japan and England. In my 30s, I went back and forth to the Middle East, writing books and making television about spirituality and can we get along, and the conflict that sort of enmeshed the world at that time. And this, in the context of the conversation we're about to have, I think of now as a kind of a linear life. Like, I figured out what I wanted to do early. I did it for no money. I had some success and got married and got children, and had children. And then in my 40s, my life blew up. First, I got cancer at 43 as a new dad of 3-year-old identical twin daughters. Then I had some financial troubles in the last recession. And then my father, who got Parkinson's and became very depressed and tried to take his own life 6 times in 12 weeks. And as a storyteller, I didn't know how to tell this story, and I didn't want to. But when I did, I found out that everyone has these moments when their life gets turned upside down. And that is really what propelled me in the work that brings me here today, which is I've now spent the last 6 years crisscrossing the country, collecting and analyzing hundreds of life stories of Americans of all ages and all walks of life, who've gone through life transitions, health transitions, now work transitions, trying to make sense and sort of, codify and bring forth a series of tools for how we can all navigate the changes in our lives. And of course, as we all know, because it's in the news every hour, the AI revolution, creates this moment where the pace of change, which is already faster than at any time of history, is only going to accelerate.
Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, he could only write because of what he lived through in the Holocaust. And when I hear about the ups and the downs in your life, I'd love to know, what do you feel like better qualifies you to be able to be an author and a life coach? Is it the fact that you've experienced the downs? Or because listening to you now, I mean, just your last couple of weeks alone, you'd say, if ever there was a person who's found meaning in life, it's Bruce Feiler. But what do you think is it really about your life experience that has best prepared you to provide the coaching that you do?
Well, that's a beautiful question. And I would say a couple of things. I think, first of all, I grew up, I mentioned at the outset of this, I grew up as a fifth generation Jew in the American South. And I love the South. I love the stickiness and the storytellingness. But I grew up Jewish in the South, which meant that I was a part of it, but apart from it at the same time. And I love being Jewish, but the stickiness and the familyness and the storytellingness. But not only did I grow up separate from the history of Judaism for 3,000 years, but also even American Judaism, because this was in the South. And I grew up a part of it and apart from it. And I think that sort of core kind of mindset in my life has guided me. I've always said that my life is about two different things. First of all, I'm an experientialist. That's a made up word of mine, where I kind of go out into the world. I came of age in discount airfare, where you could travel and go to places and immerse yourselves in places and in questions and in topics, and kind of in my life, sort of questions really at the front edge of where life is going. But I'm also an explainaholic, actually, which is an Isaac Asimov term, right? Because I like to come back and explain kind of what it is that I found. And those are kind of really the two skills that I have, is immersion and then, bringing to life to kind of capture the questions. And I think increasingly in my life, I'm focused on this question of meaning, and you brought up Frankel's. It's the actual story is not that well known. I mean, Frankel grew up in Vienna, which was sort of the global capital of meaning, right? He lived around the corner from where Freud lived, and there was already this split in psychology between Freud and between Adler, and Frankel was always committed to meaning, and he had written this book about the core philosophy he had, which was how to find meaning in times of meaninglessness. And then the Holocaust was brewing, and he had the opportunity to escape. In fact, he got a visa to come to the United States, and then he went home, and he his father mentioned that the synagogue had been burned, and there was one piece of marble from the Ten Commandments that had fallen down, and he saw this because he stopped into the synagogue on the way home, and it said basically, honor your parents. And he realized he couldn't leave his parents. And so he ripped up the visa and he stayed. His mother, father, and wife were all killed in the Holocaust. He was in the same camp as his father. And when he walked into the camp, they confiscated the manuscript of his book. And one of the ways that he survived was lying in bed at night and telling the story over and over to himself. And then when he ultimately got out, he sat down and he wrote down the part of the manuscript that he had said over and over. It took him 9 days. And then that was published originally in German. And then when it came out, it was Man's Search for Meaning. And what that book did was, first of all, say exactly what you said, which is we can find meaning in suffering. But it set up what still continues today, which is sort of a tension between happiness and meaning, right? So happiness is an emotion, right? It's fleeting. It's something that you experience in the present. Animals can experience happiness. But meaning is a uniquely human thing, and it involves stitching together past, present, and future. And what stitches together past, present, and future? A story. And that's really what's now become the essence of my work, is trying to, bring to light this idea that we all have the story that goes on in our heads, right? We, where we came from, who we are, where we're going, where we dream of going. And that story isn't part of you, like it is you in a fundamental way, right? Life is the story that you tell yourself. And that story in a lot of ways is the backbone of Life is in the Transitions, which is my last book. And then when that book came out in 2020, it was very clear that the pandemic was going to change everything around work. And then I went out in the workspace, and what I found was the idea of a work story is not really how we talk about work. And I think that the arrival of AI into this conversation really puts more urgency on that question.
So I recently took my girls, not twins, 13 and 15-year-olds, to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. And when I was reading your book, the newest book, The Search, I was thinking a lot about, just the stories that I had heard. And it's an amazing, I imagine you've probably been there, but an amazing multimedia set of exhibits that really tell the story in just a shockingly raw way. But you can't come away from there not feeling really moved about the human experience. And when I was reading The Search, I love this concept that work doesn't have to be a 4-letter word. And it's okay for work to be a big part of your identity. But in order for that to be the case, you have to feel like you have some ability to influence or to use that thing that you use to produce an income or generate an income. You have some control over it, and it is a source of meaning for you. So when you in the book talk about ghost jobs and kind of where work is headed, just curious to know from your perspective, how do you feel like that complicated relationship between work and identity play out, as things like AI and automation are introduced further into the workplace?
So this is, of course, the heart of the matter, and I appreciate your going there. And let me just say a few things about this. Okay, thing number one is, speaking of Yad Vashem and the pain of that, right? And the stories that will never be told. One of the things that happened it may have happened with your girls, when we took my girls there, when they were around the age of your girls, is they gave them a story. They kind of twinned them with some twins who had killed, and the idea, you can live out the story that they never got to live out. But actually, the most powerful story of work ever told is the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis. And the reason it's the most powerful story is when Adam and Eve get kicked out of the garden, what is the quote unquote punishment that they endure? The answer is work. Right? Because of that, now suddenly you have to till the fields, right? And you have to do labor. Paradise was perceived to be the opposite of work. And the worst thing you could imagine happening to you is that you work. And if you go across the languages, the Greek word for work, derives from slave. The Latin word for office, comes from duty. The word for work in language after language means, not an enjoyable activity. And so the huge burden that we all carry is that work is not supposed to be meaningful and not supposed to be a source of happiness. And I actually think, kind of in an odd way, that we have millennials to thank for flipping this. Okay. So those of us who are 50 plus, right, we grew up with this legacy idea that work was not supposed to make you happy. And there's a massive change going on, which is that millennials are saying finding meaning in work is much more important to me. Okay. And, I asked people in these work story interviews that I did, which are for the backbone of the search, as you know, the first question I asked was, what's the number one thing about work you learned from your parents? And person after person said the value of hard work. In fact, when we crunched the numbers, it was 67% of people said what they learned from their parents is the importance of working hard, right? The young people do want to work hard. But when I asked what was the downside that they learned from the parents, they said unhappiness, overwork, and strain on the family. Okay. And those were each about a third. And there is the rub of what's happening now. People want to work hard, but they're no longer prepared to overwork, sacrifice balance, meaning, purpose, identity, happiness, all of these things. And they have led the way, and Gen Z is following them. So the book is built around what I call kind of 3 lies and a truth about work. And the first lie is that you have a career. The idea of a career is a historical anomaly that was just invented 100 years ago. Right? For most of human history, people lived where they worked and they worked where they lived. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution, when people sort of a third of the country moved from rural areas to urban areas and millions more joined them from overseas, that you had to get people jobs. And so, this idea was invented in Boston by a guy named Frank Parsons. And the idea was, once in your life, in your early 20s, if you were a male, they would sit you down, ask you a bunch of questions, find a career for you, and you would then do it for the rest of your life. Well, that's not how we live today. My data show that we go through one work quake, as I call it, every 2.85 years. That's, 20 times in your lifetime. And so what's going on is there's no career. The second is there's no path. You can change jobs however you want for as simple a reason as you want to change jobs. Okay. Along comes something like, the mobile phone, the internet, artificial intelligence, and suddenly every job is being reinvented. And when there is no career, when there is no path, there's no penalty for getting off the path, right? Or not following a career. And so that's why 50 million Americans have quit a job in the last year. That's a third of the workforce, Dan. So when there's no career, you can quit when you want, then suddenly the balance of power between the employer and the worker is changing, and there's no stigmatization about leaving a job anymore. That creates the fluidity, right? So these are 2 of the 3 lies. We can talk about the third if you want, which gets to the ghost job, et cetera. But the one truth is that only you can tell your own story, and only you can decide what gives you meaning. And this brings us back to Frankl. And that's why the key skill today is identifying what brings you meaning, because it's not what you expected. It's not what you learned in college. It's not what you heard from your parents around the kitchen table. So the key skill is to say, what gives me meaning is different from what gives you or her or him or them. And what gives me meaning today may be different from yesterday, tomorrow, 3 years ago, 3 years from now. It's a constant process of looking deep inside yourself and figuring out how you stitch together the past, present, and future of your own work story.
You refer to the first industrial revolution, 18th century, started in the UK, but as you indicated, those concepts really spread globally fast. For hundreds of years, we've had a very complicated relationship as humans coexisting with technology. And I'd say, I don't think it's too controversial to say we're kind of at a new all-time peak in terms of tension. I'm going to try not to bait the witness here. But, a lot, certainly in the popular press, there's a sense that AI and automation dehumanize work.
Yes.
What does Bruce Feiler think about the relationship that humans have with AI and automation?
I think the frame you have is exactly the right frame. I was asked on this, the search has just come out. I've been doing a lot of, media, and I was on television actually. And somebody asked me and said, 3,500 people last month lost their job to AI. What are we going to do in the face of this kind of massive disruption? And my answer is exactly where your question started. You cannot understand what AI is going to do to work without looking at previous changes of this magnitude in the history of work. There have been basically 4 massive changes in the history of work, right? So for most of human history, as I said, people lived where they worked and they worked where they live. And 90% of people spent 90% of their time just with subsistence, okay? And people farmed and they made their own candles and they cared for their own elders and they educated their own young. Everybody did everything, okay? And that the first big change was when, that's what I call, economy 1.0 to 2.0 occurred with the Industrial Revolution, which, as you said, started in the 18th century in Britain and really kind of reached its peak in the middle of the 19th century. So that was the change from 1.0 to 2.0. And the change from 2.0 to 3.0 essentially occurred in the middle of the 20th century when we moved from an industrial-based economy to an office-based economy, right? And, call it what you want, knowledge workers, information workers, whatever you want to do, right? From people who showered before work to from people who showered after work to people who showered before work, right? So that was that big change. And the change now we have is essentially a change from, the knowledge-based economy to the networked economy, where change is happening from all corners of the globe and from all aspects of life, not least of which what's occurring with AI, generative AI, digital technology, all the things that you talk about here week in and week out. But let's go back to the Industrial Revolution. I said it in passing. A third of the population lost their jobs. And not only lost their jobs because basically there was automation now in the fields, and so therefore it didn't take as many people to harvest the crops. They then relocated to the cities. And while that was happening, there was also a fundamental change in what it meant to be human, because that corresponded, not coincidentally, but from a world in which religion and that worldview dominated into a secular world where non-religion dominated. So they were being, buffeted. They moved places, they moved jobs, they changed orientations, they changed fundamental belief systems, and not surprisingly, how they thought about work, how they thought about family, how they thought about gender relations. All of these things changed in the wake of that, okay? So what's another way of saying that? What it meant to be human changed. So now let's look at where we are in the middle of the 21st century. All these things are happening again. Okay, there's a generational change in the workforce. Now a majority of people are, under 40. That's millennials and Gen Z. There's a change in gender relations going on. Okay, there's a change in the makeup of the family, right? Because you have now 80% of women working outside of the home, and you have, let's put a number on it. Let's call it 80% of dads much more involved in family life. This is a massive human experiment that we've never experienced, and no species alive has ever done this, where moms and dads are changing their roles in real time. You're having a change in back to place in where people work, right? The work from home. Even in the recent weeks, Dan, okay, you must come, Facebook, Google, on down the line. You must come to work, but only 2 days a week, or maybe 3 days a week, right? We are for information-based workers, the 5-day work week is dead and it's not coming back, because that gets to what we talked about earlier. The family dynamic and the balance, and how people want to value their children as well as their work. And then you have this massive change around AI. And I think that the technological side of this is being talked about in real time. But the human question is the one that's being ignored. What does it mean? And I'm actually just starting a new book about this, and I've been involved in some dialogue, and I think it raises a fundamental question about what it means to be alive. But there's one place where I know the answer, and that is only you can decide what kind of work you want to do. And that this is a massive workquake, is of course the word I use in my book, a massive change that we're all going through at once, that we haven't all gone through at once in 100 years. And the one thing that must happen is that everybody listening to us must ask themselves a series of questions about what kind of work they want to do and what is it that gives them meaning.
So, Bruce, you're talking to your daughters who just started college, and they're nodding their heads and saying, "Yeah, Dad, but
yeah." When does that happen? They nod their heads. Your 13 and 15-year-olds still nod their head at you. Sorry, I'm telling you, you're on the clock, Dan. This ain't going to happen. Within 6 months, you're done. They're going to start rolling your eyes. The only reason they're nodding their heads is because they're rolling their eyes so much at you. It's coming, Dan.
Hypothetically, let's say they're saying, "Dad, but you're super successful, and so yeah, you've earned the right, to talk about finding meaning in work, but we're just getting started, and we're going to be expected to earn a living and pick a thing to do, and then maybe with our free time we'll be able to pursue a hobby or do things that are more associated with meaning." What's your counter argument? How do you convince them that meaning and labor, or meaning and contributing to society can coexist?
Well, the first thing I tell them, actually, because I'm in this moment, is don't listen to me. Yes, I happen to have some credibility and voice and, maybe even authority in this space. But if there's one thing I learned, is that one of the hardest things for people to do is to ignore the lessons of their parents. So I say, don't do it because you think I want you to do it, and don't do it because I said it. You get to write your own story. And I think that's message number one. And then the second message is that story can change over time. So I just dropped my children off at college, as we've been discussing. And a new thing from when I went to college is that there are these crazy, rabid, stay away at all costs Facebook groups of parents of the class of, in my case, 2027. And 40 times a day, these over-involved, helicopter, more than helicopter, my kid can't, do their laundry. Can you tell them how to do laundry? Or my kid can't find their way. And the other parents are politely saying, that's their job. You're not supposed to be doing their laundry anymore. That's the point. Someone posted one yesterday, Dan, that really got to me. And it was that my child wants to major in politics, economics, and ethics. And I think that's the least employable major I can possibly imagine. Please tell me what I can do to dissuade them. And of course, I've been a silent lurker, I think is the official term. And it was literally all I could do to not put a link to my book in the podcast, in the comment section, to say, first of all, it's none of your business whether you think it's employable or not. If your child is interested, that's all that matters. And you cannot anticipate. If there's one thing we know about AI, is that we don't know where it's going. Okay. We've gotten study after study. We've both seen them. You're going to lose 5% of the workplace. 25% of the workplace is going to lose their job. It's going to be, it's going to be coders. That's the people that are most threatened. No, it's going to be creative people. The answer is we don't know. Okay. And as a result, we need to prepare ourselves for the possibility that a third of the jobs in the future are jobs that we cannot even imagine. Every technology in the history of technology has created as many jobs as it's destroyed. That's just an existential fact. And that is likely to be what's going to happen here. So the question is, and the thing for young people, for anybody listening, when you don't know where it's going to go, when we know the volatility is going to increase, right? I think the signature piece of data in the search is that we go through 20 work quakes in the course of our lives. And by the way, Xers go through them more than boomers, millennials more than Xers, Zers more than millennials. A millennial woman will go through 2/3 more work quakes in their lives than their boomer mother did. Okay. But the signature piece of data is that only 45% of work quakes begin in the workplace. Conflict with the boss, you get laid off, your business shuts down, you want to start something new. That means 55%, the majority of work quakes begin outside the workplace, in your home, in your family. You get sick, you have a child, who needs your attention more. Okay, you decide to change your mind, you want to move. So in the balance between work and life, the biggest threat to work now is actually not AI. It's that we care about our personal lives and our happiness and meaning, and we're prepared not to sacrifice work anymore. Okay. So in that world, you need to look at work as a story with ups and downs and changes and changes in, most of all, what gives you meaning. Okay. So let's just so my book is built around, as you know, what I call a meaning audit, which is a set of 21 questions to ask yourself when you're in one of these moments of flex. Some of them are about the past. Like, the problem I've always wanted to resolve in my life is blank, right? Or, my earliest role models were blank, because your earliest role models are effectively the first choice you make about work. You can't pick your parents, but you can pick your role models, and it's not who they were, it's what you valued about them. To the present, I'm in a moment in my life. I mean, if you can ask one question, this is such an AI friendly question, right? If I'm in a moment in my life when blank, I'm in a moment in my life, it's a when question in the who, what, when, where, why, how. I'm in a moment in my life when blank. Okay. I'm in a moment in my life when I need to make money because I'm paying off my student debt, right? Or in my case, I have 2 children going to college. Or I'm in a moment when I want to go be involved in the latest technology, right? I want to be involved in AI, right? I want to be involved in driverless cars. I want to be involved in carbon scrubbing or whatever it is. Or I'm in a moment when, I've been doing the same thing for 20 years and I want to give back. Okay. So I'm in a moment when I want to run for political office in my life. I tell a story in my book. I got an email this morning, like an hour ago, from the city councilman of Alhambra, California. And they're hosting a special event for somebody who's profiled in my book, and they want me to write a letter to this man. He grew up in Vietnam and escaped in the next to the last plane that was escaping and went to a resettlement camp. And his father was blind and needed help from his mom, and he raised his young children. And then he went on to become a school teacher. And even that wasn't enough. And he ultimately ran and he was the first Vietnamese American elected to the school board in this town in California. So he was never at a moment in his life when he wanted to make a lot of money. He was at a moment when he wanted to help students, and ultimately he wanted to give back in a bigger way. And the point is, not only do you not have to, you almost assuredly will not make the same decision at 21 and 31 and 41 and 51 and 61 and 71. You're going to make this decision 20 times in your life. So what I tell my children is, if this question engages you right now, dive in. Aim for excellence, work hard, have balance, but just because you're doing it now doesn't mean you're going to have to do it in the future. That's the great opportunity. Don't lock yourself into pre-existing narratives of your country, your community, or even your parents.
When you were in your darkest hour, maybe during your bout with cancer or your father's mental challenges. What was it that got you out of that dark place and enabled you to write some of the amazing, empowering books and tell great stories like what you're telling on this podcast when you were in most need of your own coaching?
I think the instinct that I had, and that I now understand many people had, is the instinct to retreat, to isolate, to, pour gravy of pity over your head, to be in a fetal position with the cat under the covers, and I don't even have a cat. But I think that in retrospect, I think that the most damaging and difficult and restricting thing that I did was the isolation, the shame, the self-pity, the fear. I mean, I've looked hundreds of people in the eye and said, what's the biggest emotion you felt or experienced in your life transition? The number one answer was fear. How am I going to get through? What is going to happen to me? Will I make it? Will I still have a job? Will I still have, how can I move if I don't have legs, whatever it might be? The second was sadness. I liked having that loved one. I liked having that job, right? I liked, being able to call my parents and now my parents are not here. Or I liked having this house before the roof was ripped off in a tornado. But the third, which surprised me, is shame, right? I'm ashamed of what I did when I was drinking. I'm ashamed that I have to ask for help. I'm ashamed that I have a child who has special needs or whatever it might be. And I think that fear and sadness and shame, drive you toward isolation. And I think that for me, the most empowering thing that I did was to ultimately go out and find comfort that other people were going through it too, and then ultimately find wisdom, right? It's why in life is in the transitions, one of the essential skills of a life transition is sharing it with somebody else. And why I ask people in the search, like, what was the best advice you got in a life transition, and who is it in a work transition, and who was it from, and what wasn't? And interesting, the most powerful advice came from colleagues, followed by professionals. Family members were last, since we started talking about my wife. And I don't know why this is. My hunch is that because our family members are stakeholders in our own work choices, because it's possible if we're choosing meaning over money, that might make them uncomfortable or whatever. But I think it turns out that colleagues who you think would be the last person because you might be leaving a workplace, it turns out they actually support us. What was the best advice people got by sharing their story and their questions and their fear and their sadness and their shame with others? Answer: 3/4 of people said the best advice they got was to do what deep inside they already knew they wanted to do. Like, we don't need a punch in the face, or kick in the butt. We want a pat on the back. So if you are in a work transition, because we're all in work transitions, if a third of the country has quit a job in the last year, and another third has renegotiated where they work or how they work or when they work, right? Like, that's 100 million Americans, Dan, who will sit down today. What did you say earlier? Like, good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are. This morning, this afternoon, tonight, tomorrow, this summer, this fall, next year, and say, honey, I'm not happy with what I'm doing, and I want to do something that makes me happy. What we've lacked in work is a toolkit for finding unhappiness, which is what I've tried to provide in the search. But the larger answer to this question lies inside of you, which is why, if I could just give you one question as we wrap up here, it would be: the best advice I have for myself right now is blank. The best advice I have of how to think about work in the age of AI and the future of work in a world in which meaning, something I never thought about in my work life, has now come full circle and front of stage, and I can now have it. The best advice I have for myself right now is blank. You know the story you want to tell. The question is, will you have the courage to stand up to your younger self, to your expectations, to your family, to your culture, whatever, and say, I'm committed to doing the work that gives me meaning right now?
Bruce, I've listened to so many of your interviews and I've read most of your books, including I saw the recent interview you did with Fareed Zakaria on CNN. Wonderful job. But I got to say, Fareed, this conversation really gave me chills. It was just the humanness of it. And, back to the real thesis of this podcast about keeping the humanness present, even when we feel like it's being disrupted by technology. You do such a great job of really sharing why there's so much to be excited about, and we control our destiny. So thank you for sharing that with me and with our audience.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Anything you want to tell the audience about where they can learn more about you and your great work?
Well, I appreciate this invitation. I'm Bruce Feiler. That's Feiler. I'm at brucefeiler.com and on all social media channels. Yes, the search is available wherever you get books. And as is Life is in the Transitions, I write the Nonlinear Life newsletter, as you said, weekly on these themes, which is brucefeiler.substack.com. And I love to engage people and tell me what you're thinking about and tell me how we can all commit to being human in the age of transhuman.
And one final reference to Bruce's wife Linda's great episode on this podcast back from 2021, but nice bookends. Linda's and now Bruce's interviews. Bruce, I loved hanging out. Thanks for coming by.
My pleasure.
Well, gosh, that's a wrap for this week on AI and the future of work. As always, I'm your host, Dan Turchin from People Rain. And of course, we are back next week with another fascinating guest.